Welcome back to another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. As always, my name is James, and in this video, I'm going to real briefly discuss what I think GW should do with the Compendium Scrolls and really why it's a double-edged sword for them, not only in a business sense, but more of focusing on like as the game itself, and just how well Age of Sigmar plays and what it really needs. So firstly, like the biggest problem with these Compendium Warscrolls is that they are largely unavailable to new players. It's not true of every single faction that has these Compendium Warscrolls, but like Death, for example, the entire Tomb King's army, for Order, Bretonia, and a lot of the Empire pieces, kind of fall into this category. And really, those are the two examples as well that these armies really need them to be competitive. At least by what I would define as competitive. But as I was saying, with those being unavailable to new players, and with the goal of Age of Sigmar to take as much of the classic Warhammer fantasy game, that kind of community that played that, and to pour over as much of that as possible, and to expand upon that with new players, that was really GW's goal, because Warhammer Fantasy Battles was not financially viable for a company of that size, which is why they kind of blew up the game and started over. So keeping these Compendium Warscrolls where these models aren't even available from GW anymore. Sometimes you can pick them up on the secondary market, normally for inflated prices that are borderlining on the absurd. That hurts in two ways. Obviously that doesn't encourage the newer player to necessarily like go out and buy the army that they most like the way they play, or it kind of gives in many ways an unfair advantage to the older guard, the people who've been playing for a while, and you really can't, because you really don't have those available to you as a newer player, unless you go outside of GW, which hurts GW's business plan in the sense of making money off their game. If you want a Tomb King's army, because Tomb King is the best that Death has, you're going to pay far, far, far too much from secondary sources, and GW won't see a penny of that. And so that's problematic for them in a business standpoint. And really, the game where it's at right now, there's far too many uh, units out there, and even sometimes like these are smaller groups for every one of the four Grand Alliances that would fall into this kind of compendium status. Units that aren't really produced anymore, units that are on the way out, units that have been genericized, like whatever it might be. If you take all of that away, you have a much, much smaller game with much less selection, which ultimately in any kind of strategy game is a big problem. And so that's kind of why you know GW is at, in my opinion, a difficult point in terms of, do we continue to produce rules for these things and update them in the new editions of the Journal's Handbook, and all, because ultimately they're not seeing a return right on their investment of their time and their effort. If they update these war scrolls at all for the second Journal's Handbook, and ultimately if they even keep them within kind of Age of Sigmar General's Handbook 2.0, like whatever edition we want to call it, right? So personally, I think that these Compendium Scrolls need to go, and I hate to say that to a degree, because right now I am building Tomb King's units to try to make my Death army more powerful. And again, these are all like converted. I'm not going to pay through the nose on secondary markets. It's quite frankly not worth it when I can make my own. I think that they need to rotate out, similar to like any collectible card game, like Magic or Hearthstone, or really just about anything. The power level on some of these things is too great. It's too high. And again, Tomb Kings is like the obvious example. Like Tomb Kings places so highly in almost every tournament where they're seen, and quite frankly, like that makes for a very boring meta, and that's that's a problem. Ultimately, the games like Warhammer are always going to suffer is a relatively stagnant meta. Um, you'll have like new updates to like units, new armies that come out, whatever, and that might shake it up a little bit. But ultimately, most things will remain static for long periods of time. And so, at least rotating out the Compendium Scrolls is a way to kind of shake up um, Age of Sigmar. And ultimately, I think that all strategy games need that to a degree to keep it fresh. But I would like to see them kind of included in what I would call like a Golden Age edition of Age of Sigmar, like a Golden Age rule set. And again, we see this in games like Magic, um, where you'll have like your standard or like your current kind of format, which is like X amount of releases back. It's like a limited pool, and then you'll have like your open Golden Age games, whatever they're called, depending on whatever game you're playing. That basically allows you access to anything that's ever been released, and I'd like to see, something like that in Age of Sigmar as well. Um, you don't really see a lot of that in more of the tabletop miniature space, but I think Age of Sigmar, especially having kind of like the prequel game of classic Warhammer, which we haven't really seen a whole lot of that. Like, you can say 40K had Rogue Trader and things, but that game never had like the mass popularity that Fantasy Battles or 40K had. So this is really, in many ways, the first time that we've seen like a game spawn a game directly. Um, and so that, this is kind of the first time, in my opinion, we have like the groundwork for that. But ultimately, like if GW is going to remove these Compendium Scrolls, they really need to hurry up and replace these units and these armies. If you just remove all of the Tomb Kings and the Vampire counts and you don't give Death anything else, for example, then you have a significantly smaller army, and that a range of models you have available to you, and it again it ruins, I'm sorry, not ruins, it lessens the quality of the game. If you're playing a strategy game, part of what's, at least in my opinion, enjoyable about it is the strategy and the tactics itself, right? And whenever you reduce the available options to you, and you simplify the game in that way, that detracts overall from what a lot of the aspects that I consider fun, and I know quite a few other people do as well. So, like I said, it's a bit of a two-edged sword for GW. Ultimately, I think that the Compendium Scrolls have to go, but before this can happen, GW's really got to get on the ball and looking at these armies that would be, the most strongly affected by this, and say, hey, we've got to do something to replace these, instead of just giving us more Stormcast garbage that, you know, honestly, I'm getting sick of seeing. Um, so with that, I'm going to leave it there. Until next time, this is James, and happy gaming.